Hey everyone, we have an awesome tutorial for you. This shot was created by Justin Acree, an art director and professional matte painter working out of New York City. And with it, we're going to look at how he used paint and stick to make this shot look great. Here's a lightning fast breakdown of the shot, so you have an idea of how much went into creating the final look. And here's a look at all the textures that were created using paint and stick in After Effects. Meaning the huge amounts of detail that you're seeing here, Justin was able to create in After Effects without having to go back into Cinema 4D at all. This shot shows the composite without paint and stick, and this wipe is showing all the layers that were added using paint and stick. There's a night and day difference in the quality and the believability of the scene. In this video, we'll show you how to create the paint and stick passes in Cinema 4D. We'll look at how Justin painted to these sidewalls. We'll make the side of the boat look wet by painting a reflection matte. We'll paint pollution onto the water. We'll dirty up our character's clothing. And we'll look into some finishing touches like depth of field. So let's get started. So here's the animation in Cinema 4D. And this is what the shot looks like rendered. In Cinema 4D, the goal was to nail the lighting, but not to worry so much about the texturing and matte painting that would be done in paint and stick. Justin rendered about a dozen passes to give more flexibility in compositing. Here are some of them. Now let's take a look at how to add the paint and stick pass to the render. In your render options, it's under Effect and Paint and Stick. If you go to render straight from here, you'll notice the passes are here, but they're both going to be black. There are two ways you can handle this. One, under plugins, there's this paint and stick auto setup, and you can just click this. This will add the post effect. It'll press the step 1 button, adding paint and stick tags to every object in your scene, and it'll also press the step 2 button, setting your multipass render to a 32-bit EXR, not using a multi-layer file. I'll undo that. Alternatively, if you don't want to save to an EXR for whatever reason, you can just press the 1 button to add the paint and stick tags to the scene, and handle the export yourself. Just a note, this step 1 button sets up the paint and stick tags in a very specific way, so it's not the same as just going and manually adding paint and stick tags. You don't actually have to press the step 2 button here. It's possible that other formats could be used. However, we don't officially support any of them, so we would highly recommend just pushing this button, which will export your passes as 32-bit single-layer openexrs. So now let's take a look at the render. This is what your sticky pass should look like, and this is what your ID pass should look like. The list of ID colors starts at 0, meaning that it starts as black, so sometimes when you're looking at this pass, it's going to be very dark and you won't be able to see it. If your ID pass is looking very dark, click your filters, and then bring up the exposure until you can see everything. So the setup is that simple. You could take this into After Effects and start painting. However, we're also going to render out separate buffers because they can be very useful when we're painting in After Effects. Let's say we want to render out a separate buffer for just the character. Under your paint and stick settings, you can click Edit Buffers, and that will bring you over to this tab over here. Or you can get here by opening your project settings, Control-D on Windows, Command-D on Mac, and opening this paint and stick tab. To add a new buffer, just press Add. So now I have a buffer created for my character, so I'll select the objects I want on there, just the character and his sword. Then for my paint and stick tags, under Render Buffer Visibility, I want to turn the visibility on. Now I'll render and we'll see where we're at. Here's my main buffer, and here's the new one, the character alone buffer, and its ID pass. So I'm just going to add a few more buffers. I know I'm going to want to paint to this water, but I'm going to want to get the character and the boat out of the way to make that easier. So what's the easiest way to include everything but 2 objects? First, I'll create a new buffer. Then, I want to select every paint and stick tag in my scene. So we have a button here called Select Paint and Stick Tags. It selects every paint and stick tag. Down here, you'll notice every paint and stick tag is set on for the main buffer. They're either visible or not visible for the character buffer, which is noted by this slash, and everything is off for the paint on water buffer. So first, I'll turn everything on for the paint on water buffer, then I'll select the objects that I want to remove. So I'll select my character, the raft, and his sword. Then I'll turn off their render visibility for the paint on water buffer. Now I'll render again. So again, here's the main buffer, and here's the paint on water buffer. The previously selected objects are removed. The last thing I want to render is a background buffer. I know I'm going to want to paint on the boat in the background, and these foreground objects are overlapping and getting in the way. I'll press Ctrl D on Windows, Command D on Mac, and press Add, and I'll name this Boat and Wall Background for the boat over here and the wall over here. Then I'll select all the paint and stick tags of the whole scene and add everything to this boat and wall background buffer. Then I'll select all the foreground objects. And turn off their visibility on this buffer. Now I'll render and see how this looks. We have the main buffer, the character alone, the water layer, and the background layer. These passes should give us plenty of flexibility, so that's all we're going to render out. Now when it comes to tidying up the scene, we have a few helpful features here. Some of you may find that these paint and stick tags get in the way because there are a lot of them. We have this button here, Hide Paint and Stick Tags, and that's just going to hide all of them. It doesn't actually delete any data. You can always show them again by clicking the Show button. And there are a lot of cool features on the tags that we're not going to get into in this tutorial, but please check out the website for more info on how to use the exporter. There's one last thing I want to talk about using the exporter, and I'm just using a simpler scene here because there's a lot less going on and it will be easier to show. Let's say you have a scene that you've already rendered and you just want to render the paint and stick pass separate. You're using GI or caustics or anything that renders really slow, and you don't want to re-render all the other layers or the main image at all. Well, the first thing you'll notice is that if you have the paint and stick pass as part of your regular render, when you go to render this, it's going to have to render the whole scene, just to kick out those two render passes. So this is a huge waste of time. So we have a feature here, paint and stick only render settings. So I'll click this, and you'll see it creates a child render setting for your primary render setting that renders paint and stick only. Now when you render, you'll notice it's extremely fast. Because it's ignoring lighting or any of the fancy stuff, it's just rendering the sticky pass and the ID pass. That's all we need to talk about with the Cinema 4D exporter for now. Let's get back into After Effects. The next step is to bring all the passes into After Effects. And first I just want to get a basic comp going using all my render passes from Cinema 4D. It's a solid start, but it needs a lot of work. The boat on this side and the wall on this side are both looking pretty empty, so we're going to overhaul this using paint and stick. The first step was to use After Effects and Photoshop to add tons of details to the boat and the sidewall. For this particular example, we're not going to show every step because that would take hours. We're just going to toggle on the various layers that were used. Justin created rust, scratches, weathering, graffiti, burn marks, and more to make these two objects look a lot cooler and more realistic. Justin treated this shot like a matte painting, meaning he wasn't concerned with how these textures would look as a texture on a 3D object. He just wanted them to look perfect in context of this particular shot. So here's before, and here's after. One thing to make note of is a lot of this texture should appear behind this water and behind this boat. Justin used the paint and stick buffer system to render out a sticky pass with just the boat and just the wall. And of course he rendered the ID pass to match, which you can see if I crank up the exposure. I'll make a new solid, and I'll place this above my texture layers just for organization. And I'll label this boat and wall paint. And I'll apply paint and stick. And I'll source the previously mentioned sticky pass into the sticky pass slot. And its matching ID pass into the ID pass slot. Before I stick this down, for those of you who have never used paint and stick before, I just want to explain how that works. So for you to stick paint down, first off you have to have something painted inside of paint and stick. So for example, I'll just draw a smiley face here. So this drawing of a smiley face is on this keyframe. If I move my time slider off of this keyframe, the paint won't show up, and if I move the keyframe over and put the time slider back on it, the keyframe is going to show on that frame. So if I move this keyframe back and then put the time slider on it, now the frame is back at the start. So the keyframe represents my smiley face, and if I solo this layer, you'll see that this smiley face is the only thing on this layer with paint and stick on it. So if I press the stick button, then you'll see that this paint is stuck, and I'll solo this layer. That's the only thing on this layer. So now that keyframe has been converted into stuck paint. To delete all of this paint, I'll use the delete stick button and the delete paint button. So now, what if I want to glue down a texture that wasn't drawn in paint and stick? To do that, we have a feature that lets you screen capture other layers to convert them to paint and stick paint. So So just for example's sake, I'll turn on this rust layer here, and I'm also going to put in some text. Next, I would solo the rust layer, and then I would solo the text layer as well. Now that my comp is showing everything that I want to screen capture, I select the instance of paint and stick, hold down shift, it'll tell me about to capture the screen as paint, and notice that there's no keyframe down here on paint and stick. Then I click. Now that keyframe has my screen capture. So now I can just delete this text because it's not needed. And I'm just going to shut off the visibility of the rust texture because I'm planning on using that later. So now if we solo paint and stick, we're looking at this keyframe here, and this is the paints that we screen captured. This text is no longer editable because it's paint and stick paint. And same with this rust texture, it's just an exact copy of what we had soloed at the time that we did our screen capture. And again, if I move my time slider, we're not on that keyframe, nothing shows up. If I move my keyframe over and then move my time slider over the keyframe, that paint is showing up. So of course I can always add more paint to this paint keyframe. And because it's paint, it's also erasable. So again, I'm going to move this keyframe back to the first frame where I want to stick from. And then I'm going to press the stick button. So when I play this back, the paint is stuck. One thing to be aware of, this keyframe down here is actually destroyed when you stick it down because it's converted from paint on a single frame to stuck paint. If I were to delete this stuck paint, now it's gone and there's nothing on the keyframe either because the paint on the keyframe was converted to stuck paint. In the future, this may change. However, for the time being, we would recommend that whenever you have to stick something down, you save that as a pre-comp so you can always screen capture it again if anything needs to change. So now I'm going to turn everything back on because we're going to get back to the previous example with all the matte painted elements for this shot. So here are all the layers that need to be stuck. And the first thing I'm going to do is pre-compose them for organization purposes. And I'll name them boat and wall paint. I'll solo my texture to prepare for the screen capture. And again with paint and stick, there's no paint here. I'll select paint and stick, and then shift click. Now I'll turn off the visibility of the texture layer because we don't need it, and I'll just double check on paint and stick. You'll see that the paint is here, saved onto this keyframe. This paint is ready to be stuck, so I'll press the stick button, and now I'm going to unsolo it and play it back. Now that paint is stuck. However, of course, we painted on a sticky pass of just the boats, so this paint is overlapping the foreground objects. Just as a reminder, if you're going to render a sticky pass that contains just the background objects and not the foreground objects, then you'll also need to render a matte so you can put this properly in the background. There are other ways, but the matte is probably the simplest one to think about right now. Here's my matte, which contains all of the foreground objects, and I'll just take my paint and stick layer and set it to luma matte inverted. Now the paint is matted behind the water, and we can turn on the rest of our layers, and everything should look good. And it does. If I need to make changes, that can be done easily enough. First, I'm just going to delete this glue because I don't want it anymore. Then I'll turn the visibility of the texture of the boat and wall paint back on. One of the ways I like to stay organized is I'll take this texture and I'm going to save it on a single frame, the frame that I projected from. That way I can always go back to that frame and reproject that same texture from that same frame so I get the same results. If I want to make some paint changes to this texture, I can do so using paint and stick. Let's say I want to take this scratch layer, which I'll solo so you can see, and I want to change the scratches on it. This is a pre-composed paint layer, but I can still paint right on top of it. So if I apply a paint and stick on this layer, first I have to shut off paint on transparent so we can actually see it, and then I can use the matte brush to erase some of these scratches that I don't like. I'll click the real-time painting button so we can see this erasing happening in real time. And I'll also uncheck show brush and cursor because I don't want to see my paintbrush, I just want to see the circle when I'm erasing. I'll increase the size of the brush by holding down Control, clicking and dragging on Windows, Command, clicking and dragging on Mac. Then I can erase through the layer using the matte brush. So I'll unsolo this. Then I'll create a new solid and apply paint and stick, and paint with it to create some new scratches. I can also use filters in After Effects, such as roughen edges, And I can play with the controls here so that way this paint looks weathered so it blends in with the other paint. I'll also reduce the opacity just a little bit. I think that looks good, so now it's time to go and restick this. With paint and stick selected, I'm going to make sure that I have my texture soloed. I'm going to stay on the same frame that I previously projected from, hold shift and click to screen capture. I can hide my texture layer again, and I'll solo paint and stick and just show you that the texture has been screen captured. The luma matte is still applied, but you'll see when I turn it off, everything has been screen captured, so the paint will show correctly behind the waves, and then I'll press stick. And here's the shot played back. Making these changes is very fast and easy with paint and stick. If we had done this back in Cinema 4D and re-rendered the whole scene, it could have taken hours. Here, it only took us a few minutes. So while we're looking at the boat, I'll show you something else we can do to make this look nicer. This part of the boat should probably look wet, so one of the ways we can do that is to add in a little bit more reflection. Let's take a look at the reflection pass soloed. This part of the reflection right here is the part that I want to bring out. So I can use an exposure effect to brighten that right up. That looks about right, so I can unsolo this and add it over the top. It looks pretty good. Maybe I'll brighten it up just a little bit more. But we just want to increase the reflection on the boat, not on the water or on the fire or on any of this stuff over here. So the first thing I'll do is I'll hide the other reflections. I can use this to hide the reflections on the water and the character. I'll set my reflection pass to luma matte inverted. And now you can see with this on and off, it's looking a little bit better. But I don't want this reflection pass to have any effect back here or affecting anything in the background. You'll see as I toggle this on and off, it's changing way too much stuff in the back of the shot. I just want to add reflections to the side of the boat, and maybe a little bit on the right side too. So I want to use paint and stick as a matte, but I'm already using this layer as a matte. But this is easy to fix because there's an effect in After Effects that's made just for this. I can go to Effect, and it's under Channel, Set Matte, and I can take the layer we want to matte with, the luminance matte that we were just looking at, this one, and I'm going to choose that as my layer for the Set Matte effect. I'll set it to luminance, and then I'll invert the matte to match my previous settings. So now I can disable my track matte because the effect is doing the same thing, and I'll make a new solid with paint and stick, which will act as the track matte for this reflection layer. So the plan is to use paint and stick to matte in the reflections by drawing. I'll set the reflection passes track matte to alpha matte, so whatever we draw on paint and stick will become the alpha for this layer. So now of course you can't see the reflection pass because paint and stick is the matte and there's nothing on the paint and stick layer. So now it's time to start painting. So I'll grab this brush here, and just to show you what this looks like, it can be used to create a rough texture. And if I hide this layer so we can see its effects in the comp as a matte, you'll see there's now reflection in place of that stroke. So now I'll get to painting, and I'm going to turn on real-time drawing with this button. And now as I paint, I can reveal the reflection in real time. There's one note I want to make about real-time drawing versus fast preview. The great thing about real-time drawing is I'm updating my comp in real time, meaning the matte is interacting with the other layers and I'm seeing everything happening as fast as After Effects can do it. Now, the problem you're going to run into with real-time preview is if I have 100 layers on, which I do, it's going to be painfully slow, because After Effects has to render every single one of these 100 layers before it can show you a change to your paint. And to slow things down even more, we have a lot of expensive effects, like heat distortion and light rays and depth of field. So painting in real-time mode with all these layers on is just not going to happen. So that's why we've created this mode called Fast Preview. I'm just going to delete my paint here for a second so I can show you. Fast Preview just lets you draw all the strokes where you want them first, and it's going to prevent After Effects from rendering until you're done drawing. Now I'm going to stop drawing, and After Effects is going to render and catch up. So now you'll see those reflections are in place. So Fast Draw is great for doing the broad strokes, and I offer no apologies for that terrible pun I just made. But anyway, I'll just get these strokes generally where I want them, and then allow it to update and see how they look. Now to touch this up and perfect it a little bit, I'll solo this layer, turn on real-time painting, and continue to refine the edges. I'm also going to shut off this show brush and cursor because it's getting in the way of seeing my reflection pass. And another thing I can do is grab another textured brush, and I can erase little bits of this to just break up the pattern. I'll unsolo this again so I can see how it looks in the comp. And here's before and after. I think the last thing I'll do is I'll apply roughen edges. It's great that you can use all of the After Effects filters and effects to modify your paint. This effect is under Stylize, roughen edges, by the way. And I'm just going to play with the scale and with the border size and play with the settings until this looks sufficiently broken up. So let's go back to the comp. Turning it off, it looks like this, and on, it looks like that. Maybe the last thing is, it looks a little bright back here. So I'll grab Paint and Stick again, and I'll just make sure I have my erase tool selected. I'll solo my reflection pass again, and turn on the real-time drawing, and I'm just going to erase a little bit of this. I think that'll look a little bit better, so I'll turn this back on in the comp. And it does. Okay, so now to stick this down. Now, just to stay organized, I want to put this texture in a place where I can always use it again later. So I'll trim this to the frame that I'm going to project on, this frame. Then I'll pre-compose the whole thing, moving it into a new comp with all the attributes, and I'll call this Reflection Matte on Boat. Now, to create my paint and stick layer that will be doing the sticking, I'll make a new solid, and I'll call it Reflection Matte on Boat. I always give my paint and stick layer the same name as the texture layer, so I can always keep them together. I'm just going to hide the texture layer for a second so I can focus on the paint and stick layer. And I'll apply paint and stick to this layer. And as we showed in the previous example, I want this matte to apply to the whole boat beneath the waves. That way this matte and its effects will be revealed behind the waves when they move. So I'm going to select the sticky pass, which doesn't have any of the waves in it, just the boat, and the ID pass to match. I'll put the sticky pass layer in the sticky pass slot, and the ID pass in the ID pass slot. Now I'll solo the matte layer that needs to be stuck. I'll select Paint and Stick, hold down Shift, and click to screen capture. So I'm done with this matte texture for now, so I'll hide it, and I can just press the stick button, and now the screen capture of that matte is stuck. Now, of course, we want to see this matte applied to the reflection pass, so I'll shut off its visibility, and here it is. And let's take a look at the before and after, and now we'll play back the shot. It looks much better. So the takeaway is that you can go in and paint reflection mattes in Paint and Stick without wasting a ton of time going back to Cinema 4D and re-rendering the whole scene. Another cool thing I can do is I can paint some pollution onto this water using Paint and Stick. I'll go back to the first frame. I have a nice dirty water texture, and I'll line this up in the scene using a 3D layer. Next, I'm going to drop in a matte for the water. I'll use it as a luminance matte for my water texture. Then I'll take both of these layers and move them underneath the reflections. Then I'm going to dial in the opacity. I also want to break up this texture a little bit using a matte, so I'm going to pre-compose it, leaving the attributes in the comp. I'm going to open the comp and then split the viewer so I can look at the texture and the main comp at the same time. I have a dirt texture which I'll drag and drop. And I'm going to use this as a luma matte. And just to note how I like to work, I like to keep these windows side by side so I can see the changes that I make to my texture and see how they're affecting my comp. Maybe I'll darken the matte a little bit just to break up the texture a bit more. I think that looks pretty good, so I'm done with this texture, so I'm just going to close this window. Next, I want to paint away some parts of this texture so they're further off from the wall. I can add Paint and Stick to my matte layer to make changes to the matte. I'll shut off Paint on Transparent because I want to paint directly onto this matte. So I'll create a black brush to take away from this matte. And I'm going to soften it a little bit by lowering the alpha. I'll shut off the visibility of the matte because it's connected to the texture. And then I'm going to turn on real-time preview, that way when I draw I can see it updating my comp. So I'll just paint away the edges, because I only want a little bit of pollution, I don't want it to be everywhere, mostly surrounding the center of the scene and the boat. If I want to reverse the effects of my painting, I can use the color white. Because this is a luminance matte, wherever I paint white, that texture is going to show up. So maybe I removed a little bit too much in this area, and I'll just paint that back in. So to make this clearer, I'm just going to solo this matte. All I did was paint a little bit of black and white over this luminance matte to refine the shape. And from here, I think I'll just clean up the edges. Another thing to mention. For this part, I rendered out a sticky pass with the water without the boat on top. That way I can paint the pollution to every part of the water, so no matter where the boat moves, the pollution is going to show up underneath it. And just to explain why we're able to stick to this water, it's not actually a liquid simulation or using any particles. This is just displaced geometry. If you take a look, you can see the wireframe as it moves. So this water can be added to any sticky pass. So now to make sure that this paint goes underneath the boat, we have to take a look at the matte and make sure that that part is painted in white. I used this matte as a starting point just so I could kind of see where things would land, but now I'm going to grab a white paintbrush and I'll paint in the gap left by the boat. So now if we look at the texture, it's going over the boat, but of course on the sticky pass the boat isn't there, so it's really going over all of the water. Now that I'm done painting this texture, I'm going to pre-compose it into a single layer, and of course I have to take the camera with it because I have 3D layers in there. And I'll call this water pollution. And I'll trim this comp to a single frame so I know the frame that I projected from, that way I can always make changes later if I need to. I'll create a new solid for paint and stick, and I'll just call this water pollution to match the name of my texture. I'll apply paint and stick. To screen capture this paint so paint and stick can stick it down, I'll just solo that texture, and I'll select paint and stick, hold down shift, and click. Now I'll hide my texture layer, and I'll solo my paint and stick layer, and you can see the texture has been copied. Now I'll choose the sticky pass that showed the water without the raft over it, and the ID pass to match. Everything's set, so I'll press the stick button. Playing the scene back, you can see that the pollution sticks correctly to the water, so now we just have to grab that matte that has the raft on it, and we can use it against the pollution layer. Here it is. And last, I'll set my paint and stick layer to luma matte. So playing back through this, I found one part that doesn't look so good. This part right here. I want to show you a trick. Normally we would just erase this part here and then retexture over that same spot, but let's say we want to be really lazy about this. To save time and do this as fast as possible, we could just create a matte over this part and then blur it. So first I'll make a new adjustment layer, and I'll put this above paint and stick in my comp. Then I'll make a new solid. I'll apply paint and stick, and select the sticky pass for the water, and the ID pass. This paint and stick layer will act as a moving matte for an adjustment layer, and this adjustment layer is going to be a blur. I'll just apply a fast blur. So that's what the blur would look like, and now we just have to target the area right here where the texture isn't quite perfect. I'll set the adjustment layer to alpha matte. I'll just quickly rename my paint and stick layer. So of course you can't see the blur anymore because there's no alpha channel for the paint and stick layer because it's using paint on transparent. So I'll grab a soft brush and I'll just paint in that blur. Alright, that's not too bad. So I'm just going to solo the matte layer for a second so you can see it's blurring everything inside of this white area right here. And I'll just press the stick button to stick that down. I'll play that back and you'll see that matte is sticking to the water. And actually I'm just going to add the slightest bit of a fast blur on top of this, just to blur it a little bit more. Now I'll shut off the visibility for my matte, and when I play this back, the blur is only going to target the area underneath the paint and stick matte. So that's a super fast and lazy way to do it. Maybe I'll actually delete this right here. I'll go back to my pollution layer and grab paint and stick, and I'll grab the erase stick tool. And I'll just erase that paint that I don't want. And I think that's looking a little bit better. So to finish this off, I'm going to take these layers that I just created and I'm going to pre-compose them together. That way the blur is only affecting the paint and stick pollution layer, but none of the background layers beneath. You'll notice I haven't selected the sticky pass or the ID pass when I go to pre-compose here, but you actually don't have to select those. After Effects 2015 is smart enough to take any of the layers that are connected to paint and stick, and it will put a copy in the pre-comp right here. So everything is connected and the look is preserved even when you pre-compose. Alright, that looks pretty good. Another cool thing I want to show you is how to dirty up this character's clothing. So yes, you could just start painting on this, but using the sticky pass for the whole scene, it might be a little harder than it has to be. If you take a look, this character is sometimes overlapped by the boat. If you look at the character's knees and his legs, depending on which frame you're on, like this one or this one, you can't actually see them. But they're going to come into frame later, and then they won't have paint on them, and it's going to look a little bit strange to have that seam. So what's the easiest way to paint to the character? Just getting paint on the character and not on the raft. Well, the answer is to render out a sticky pass buffer that just has the character on it. I'm not going to show you how to do that now, I'm just going to focus on the After Effects side. So here's my sticky pass with just the character on it, and I'm going to select paint and stick, and use this as the sticky pass. And here's the ID pass. So first we have to know which layer to paint on to make him look dirtier. So the diffuse pass, not a lot of detail in there. But the reflection pass is much brighter and is responsible for most of what we see in the shirt. And it's looking very clean. So I'm going to grab a dirt texture. And I'll put it over the reflection pass. And I'll set the reflection pass to luma matte. So now this dirt pattern is breaking up the reflection pass of the clothing, making it look dirty. I'll use a bit of color correction to really exaggerate the dirt, brightening up the bright spots and darkening the dark spots. So that looks good. I'm just going to solo the matte for a second so you can see what I'm doing. With curves off, it looks like this, and on, it looks like this. I'm just increasing the contrast a bit. So of course I should see what this looks like in the composite. So I think that looks pretty good. Maybe I'll tweak it, see what it looks like if I brighten the matte. Or darken the matte. And now I'll just save this frame. And then turn off the luminance matte because I just want to see the before and after. Okay, that definitely looks better. One thing I want to do is make sure the dirt doesn't get on the sword and doesn't get on his face. I just want it on his clothing. So I'll make a new paint and stick layer, which will act as a boundary matte for my dirt texture. So I'll just loosely scribble over the areas that I want to affect and make dirty. Alright, that looks pretty good. And just to make sure, I'm going to turn on my boundary matte and my sticky pass to make sure I got everything. It looks like I missed the legs, I'll just paint those in real quick. Alright, I think that looks good. So now I'm going to solo my dirt layer. And I'll set it to alpha matte against the boundary matte. So there it is, and it's going to apply over the character. And here's what this looks like in the comp. Now that this dirt texture is done, I'm going to pre-compose it. And as usual, I'm going to trim this to a single frame on the frame that I projected from, so I can always reproduce these results later. So now I'm back to focusing on my paint and stick layer. And I already have the buffer sourced, so I can just solo the dirt texture, and I'll select my paint and stick layer, hold down Shift to screen capture, click, and now I can shut off the dirt because I'm done with it. Next, I'll press the stick button on the paint and stick layer, and you'll notice something pretty convenient happened. The paint is only applying to the character. That's because on the sticky pass, the character is the only object. The black areas are interpreted as empty space, so no paint can be applied there. So before moving on, let's just play this back and see what it looks like. It looks pretty good. So maybe what you're thinking is, I'm really sick of rendering out mats every time I want to stick something behind something else. There's got to be a better way. Well, actually, there's a way to do this that a lot of people don't know about. You can just change the object ID pass after the paint has already been applied to the whole character. So when you stick the paint, you want the paint on the entire character. And to do that, you want to have a sticky pass which has the whole character and just that character's ID, so you can paint everywhere on the character. To help explain this, paint and stick is looking for the right color on the pass to decide where the paint should be, and then it checks, okay, is the ID color the same, because that means the paint can apply there. But what we can do is we can keep the sticky pass for the character, and then we can switch in the ID pass for the scene, which has the matting for the character all taken care of. So when paint and stick goes to paint the character, it's only going to allow paint in the areas where the ID matches exactly to where it painted from earlier when you press the stick button. The raft, although it's tough to see, has a slightly different color, therefore not allowing the paint to stick there. So on my paint and stick layer, right now I have the character's ID pass selected, and I'm just going to swap that out and choose the ID pass for the scene. And now you'll notice that all the matting is correct, because when paint and stick is looking at the ID pass, it's only finding the ID for the character where the ID for the character should be. When it's looking at the part of the screen here, which has the raft on it, it's finding a different ID, so it's not showing the paint that we stuck to the character. Playing it back, everything looks good. So now we can get back to compositing. So now I'll take this paint and stick layer, and I'll put it above my reflection pass to use as a matte. Because remember, before we stuck this down, we were using this texture as a luma matte for the reflection pass. I'll select luma matte on my reflection pass. And I'll just bring up the preview exposure so you can see it looks a lot dirtier. So here's the comparison. You can see it on versus off. And maybe I'll just tweak this a little bit. I'll put on a color correction, exposure, and there. I think that's looking pretty good. So I'll just prepare it before and after. Here's before and after. You can see it makes a huge difference. And now let's play the shot back. And there we go. His clothing is looking wonderfully grimy. The last thing I want to briefly talk about are the final touches in compositing. And I think one of the most important things is depth of field. A lot of artists will do the depth of field in After Effects because it renders so much faster than doing it in 3D. So if you take a look, I'm using a depth of field plugin here, and I've just exaggerated the effect like crazy. This is called Frisch Lift Depth of Field. There's also a built-in effect in After Effects called Camera Lens Blur, which really does a very similar job, but I think Frisch Lift does a better job with large blurs, and the controls are a lot easier. So how does post depth of fields work? If you take a look, the artist rendered out a depth pass for this scene. This pass gets connected to Frisch Lift, and on the pass, anything that's close to the camera is white, and anything that's far from the camera is black. So then I can choose the depth that I want to be in focus. Probably the main reason I use Frisch Lift is for this one button here, Select Depth. So you click this, and then you just click on the character's head where you want it to be in focus, and that will set the depth that we're focusing to, which on this pass is the brightness of 177, which is the color that's on the character's head. Just for example's sake, I'll select the black, which is going to go to 0, and then I'll select something closer, which is 221. If anything were actually touching the camera, it would be at a brightness of 255, which is the brightest it can go on an 8-bit scale. But anyway, I'll reselect the character, and I'll just double check that my depth pass is connected to the depth layer on Frisch Lift. And once you turn everything back on your comp as it should be and hide the depth layer, you can just change this radius to decide how in focus or out of focus it's going to be. Normally I do a low value, I'm using 2 now, but you can always crank it up, so just for example, 15. And you can even crank it up to absurd values like 50. Just for example, I'll show you that. Which is so blurry that it's even going to start to blur the foreground, which is very close to the character. But anyway, I'll set this back to 15. And just for example's sake, if you wanted to focus the front of the boat, you just click on that with the select depth. And if you want to focus the background, just click something in the background. But anyway, I'll just set this back to the character. So the big reason I'm bringing up post depth of field is because the paint and stick pass, like most data passes, a position pass, a UV pass, a motion vector pass, etc., they don't support depth of field. So one of the easiest and most controllable ways to put depth of field in your scene is to make sure that your finished composite with all your data passes goes at the bottom underneath depth of field, then depth of field goes next, and then any finishing touches that wouldn't be affected by depth of field, like glow or color correction, those go at the top. So that concludes this tutorial. Thank you so much for watching. Check out aescripts.com/paintandstick for more information.